So the far too lengthy piece of COI that you've got is there to assist you, and we'll just go through and deal with the yellow parts. We come to it anyway. Let's just get it up first and see if we can use it. Now I realise that you won't have been able to all read through it or anything, but if you have. So have you had a chance to look through the one-page summary and the tasks that are in it? This was designed, as most of these case studies have been, for not this type of class really, but a class where you have it one day and next day or 2 days afterwards. You're given this when you leave, come back, so you've got a much longer time to go through it. And we used it. It was used in Taiwan with their judiciary, and it seemed to go quite well. So that was why I picked it. So Mr. Bala is a Tamil from Jaffna. This is 2008, so you've got to think back 10 years. So this is when the war was on, obviously still going. He was injured by the SLA in the 1990s and left with disfiguring injuries. So you've heard me before go on about physical attributes and so forth that objectively assessed can contribute to your characteristics. After recovering, he began his grocery business. We talked about grocery businesses before, and which made a lot of money. And relationship he had with AB, who supplied him goods in Kilinochchi, and when the SLA controlled that area. He was a businessman in an LTTE controlled, you know what the LTTE is, the Tamil Tigers, controlled area, and they demanded taxes and then a large sum from his business. So he could not pay it. He moved to Colombo. He was detained by the police as a Tamil, and 3 days he was beaten up, interrogated for 10 days, and then some unknown Tamil man, MN, along with 3 police, approached him in his cell and told him, and MN told the police he wasn't a member of the LTTE. And soon after, this Sinhalese man, also unknown to Bala, acting as an intermediary, using money from AB, obtained his release. So Bala did. They went off to a restaurant afterwards to celebrate, and MN joined them, and thereupon said, right, I want 1 million rupees for the LTTE Karuna group, making it more complicated. In other words, there was 2 groups of LTTE. There was 2 groups, the Karuna group with different objectives to the primary group. He was unable to pay, but due to constant demands, he and his family decided to leave. He paid the agent to get documentary evidence, including visas to Malaysia, and he tried to start a business there. And then his wife went to Canada. She got refugee status in Canada, and he tried to get there unsuccessfully. He then made his way to New Zealand, applied, was turned down by the refugee status branch, the New Zealand Immigration Department, the RSB, and he appealed to the tribunal. You've just got to assume that he applied at first instance here, and it then went on appeal to the court. Similar situation. He supplied banking correspondence, quite a lot of information from his wife, and the tribunal was supplied with the full file. I don't know whether that happens here. Does the full file get disclosed to the court? I presume it does. I don't know. Up-to-date country information and material provided from a specialist library, COO library, which is government funded and acts in an independent way. And the same full file is shared by both parties, including... So anyway, that gives you an idea. The international crisis group does pretty good, COI, it does it well. So let's assume he arrived in Japan instead of New Zealand, claimed status. What do you think are the critical issues that you must address? This is the first plane. Okay, don't go on just for refugee. You don't need all the stuff about serious harm under the ICCPR or CAT. What do you think are the critical issues in the case when you approach it, either as counsel or academic interest or as a judge? What do you think? What are the issues you should try and identify? After you've read it all, you've read the thing and you've heard from him, you've got all the evidence, what is the primary questions you want to answer? So you don't have to write everything about the person, you just have some key issues. What are they? Yes, you've got, what do you think? The issue that you need to decide on whether he is a refugee or not when he comes before you, because he's claiming refugee status, surrogate protection, because if he says he's at risk of being persecuted if he goes back. So what are the critical issues? Not just in his case, it's in every case. What are the critical issues to address? Yes? Yep, good. What do you think about the likelihood of this being clearly abusive or unfounded? Well, there may be credibility issues, but prima facie the case itself, is that one that could be dismissed as clearly abusive? What do you think? You think no. So in other words, you wouldn't try and dismiss it on some sort of papers basis and says nobody from Sri Lanka who's a Tamil has a bolter show of getting has a chance of getting refugee status? No, it's open and shut. Of course you wouldn't. It's there are almost millions, hundreds of thousands of Sri Lankan refugees who have arisen from the same problems. So you then move on to look at his credibility. But what are you doing in doing that? What's the first question? What are you going to look to do? You're going to look, and this tells you really, you're going to look first to see whether you can believe or accept his story, aren't you? So putting it neatly, you would do, if you could plagiarise from a New Zealand decision or other ones, you would think about it and you would decide what's the real issue, what's the big issue here. And so you would say, right, what I need to do is objectively, on the facts I'm about to find, is there a real chance of him being persecuted when he returns to Sri Lanka? That's the critical issue. And then, if you find that, is it for a convention reason? And perhaps if it's not that, is there an IFA or IPA or whatever we like to call it? So those are the sort of critical issues in it, aren't they, when you think about it? All I'm saying is for decision making, that good decision makers want to know what the issue is before they start going through the case. And before you analyse it, often in cases, those are the primary things, there are other issues that because the story is far-fetched or something, the credibility issue may come up as a prime issue. And in fact, credibility should be assessed in every case, as we're saying in that chart. So that's why you're going off first, to find the credibility of his past and present situation. So, yep. So you can understand what I'm saying about finding the issues first. So it's no use, it's not just a story about what happened in Sri Lanka or reading all the stuff here, although you need to read it in depth if you're hearing the case. You've got to know what you're looking for. And that's why you want to get trained, and as a lot of people did after we did this, they had them, a lot of the judges in some countries all have them now, in a format like this, and particularly in Europe, and they put them in nice plastic and they have them on the desk. And so it's what we call a crib sheet. I don't know if you know what that means. You can crib what you're sort of been looking for, particularly if you haven't done much of it, and think, what do I do next? And so this is there to do that for you. Okay, that's the first issue, and it's not a difficult one. The next one is where it gets a bit tricky. From the outline you've got, presuming you obtained it after a full, fair hearing of the claim in an oral hearing, and you referred to the highlighted COI we've got here. The first question is, and I'll try and find the pieces if you tell me what they are that concern you, are there areas in the credibility of his evidence that sort of immediately hit you that you'd want to check out? Anything in his claim or the synopsis, the summary of it, that looks a bit strange or that you would want to look at in more depth? Or do you think it's a totally believable story? Yes, he didn't get any choice in that. They just overran the area. And so he wouldn't have had any choice in that. He's there through force of necessity. You can't pick up your shop and take it somewhere else when it's been overrun. You see what I mean? It's a controlled area. It was So that's not a matter of choice. Yep, you had some concern. Yeah, that's a good point, because it has a sort of tone about it. Maybe it's because I've seen thousands of cases where you start to think, is this really believable? That some fairy godfather or what would suddenly turn up from nowhere and say to him, I'm going to get you released, and this nice man is going to pay bribes or somebody to the police to get you out, and then you all go off for a dinner, and then the man wants payback. It may be right. It possibly could be, but because there's always people on the make, or see people that are put in jail and know that they have a lot of money behind them. So how can I get some money out of them? And this is a nice little scheme to do it. You have an agent that helps you do it. Then the guy who's really put up the money comes along and said, right, now it's time to get 1 million rupees from you. And he is, maybe he's an LTTE guy, maybe he's something else. Maybe he's just a complete, what do you call it, gang or something or other that goes around stealing money for the hell of it. So, yeah, that's, I think, maybe we'll go through this fairly quickly, but that's one of the main concerns in it, that you would want to look and question that quite closely and get the detail. Anything else that you can see sort of prima facie hits you in the face, as we say, is as a credibility issue? Anything that goes towards his credibility or may enhance it that's in there? Yep, absolutely. She's been through a test in a strongly potential examination of her case based on similar grounds and so forth, no doubt, and she was, which was successful ultimately, must have gone on appeal or something, and so that's why his case, or similar things to his case, the wife would probably be a particular social group category, dependent on his predicament, and it's been given refugee status in Canada. So what you would do is see if you can get a copy of the decision, and that from Canada, which would be readily available if the wife, because she's got a copy of it, and if it was sent, to you and produced to the court, it would perhaps enhance the guy's claim because it had been looked at more deeply and a lot of questions asked in Canada. It could also be a problem, couldn't it, if he didn't produce it? because then the immediate suspicion would be that it wasn't as favourable as... So you can see how things just from this sort of synopsis ring bells for you and say, we need to look at that. So it's not gut feel, it's just pretty obvious that you should check these things out and know about them. So does that cover all the sort of areas of potential credibility in his evidence? Anything else? Pro or, for or against? Well, it does. Whoa, why? The prime reason for that is that Malaysia is a country that tends to tolerate potential refugees, although they're not a party to the convention. So he's got to eat, and he's got to perhaps send money to family and so forth. So it's very common in Malaysia, if you wanted to check it out. It is probably to the core issue. Is it really relevant to the core issue of he's a refugee in Sri Lanka? What do you think? Anybody have thoughts on that? But he went to Malaysia to get out of the place, probably one of the few places he could get a visa to go to. And he started a business. Is that relevant to whether he's going to be persecuted, a risk of being persecuted back in Sri Lanka? Yep. Well, yeah, you could, I suppose, get to the situation if he went to another country and started getting persecuted, it could become relevant, but he doesn't have a second nationality and he doesn't have the right to seek protection from, there's no failure of state protection by Malaysia. But no, your point's a good one. It lacks materiality. And so it's not really going to the core of the issue at all. It's interesting, but really pretty irrelevant. Yeah. But he didn't, did he? But he eventually got to New Zealand. He's before you, he's not in Malaysia. You see what I mean? He's got to a signatory state. And so if he wants to get refugee status, he can claim it for confirmation in New Zealand. If he's in to go a bit beyond what the remit of this case is, but if he's in Malaysia, as I said, Malaysia is a country that is reasonably tolerant of having people from all around the place. In other words, they sort of, perhaps putting it crudely, can't be bothered getting rid of them, and they employ people and don't get in the way, and so they don't actively go about throwing them all out, even though they may have no status or virtually no status there. So the only thing you have a possibility is the UNHCR operates there and does go through processes. In fact, a good friend of ours is doing that work, isn't he, from a Japanese friend of ours in the UNHCR, is actually working for them doing such assessments. And they may find him under a slightly different set of rules that the UNHCR has itself, which ends up in what they call a mandated refugee. You're mandated by the UNHCR, which is not quite the same as refugee status here that we've been talking about. So, but very similar. And so, but has any of you worked in Malaysia? That's right, that's the appointment. You've summed it up. There are eternal queues, they call it, outside the offices in KL. And there's a lot to come. It's one of the major routes into places like New Zealand, perhaps a little less to Australia, but because it's not a difficult stop up. You've got one plane. If you can get yourself into Singapore particularly, it's even easier. You've got 6 planes a day flying to New Zealand, so your chances are not difficult. And even from KL, there's probably 2 or 3 a day. So it's not, if you can find fraudulent documents or whatever you can do, you might be able to find yourself a visa. Although, to be frank, all these cases have people at the airports trying to spot that in the first place and not letting them on the plane, if you're realistic. Interdiction, it's called. People get in the way. Yeah, sorry. Go. Yep. Yes. No, it wouldn't. But there are countries that try that, but the Refugee Convention doesn't say which country you should go to. In other words, if he was in Malaysia, probably because he's got a reasonably good chance of having a safe life there, and they were a party, then you would. Perhaps you would make a claim to the government, not to the UNHCR, to claim there. But because it isn't, they want to move on. But there's no reason why he couldn't stay in a place like that for several years and have the potential to do it, and then go on, like he tried to do, to go to Canada to get his family. And so you don't have to exercise a choice, but if they were, it's a good point to make, because it is another point of credibility. If he had arrived, for example, maybe Japan's not the best example, but if he'd arrived in a country like the Philippines, which has a very good, although not many people use it, determination system, then you would want to ask him, well, why didn't you apply in Philippines when you were there? And because, you really quite closely question them on that point. It doesn't mean to say, they still have the right to go somewhere else, but you'd want to know why, if you were fleeing, that the Philippines wasn't good enough, and so forth. And so then often for a mixture of reasons, they'll say, well, there's a guy that goes around shooting everybody, and I don't like that very much, and because people from where I come are presumed to be in the drug trade. There's all sorts of things. Or I'm a Muslim, and therefore it's a problem living in Malaysia. All sorts of things. Plus, I want the betterment of my family. People don't come in this package of just being refugees. They have economic interests and all sorts of other things. Or I've got 3 cousins living in New Zealand and I know they'll look after me. And all those sorts of things are reasons to take the next step. You've got another question. He's good. He's going well. He's on a roll. Come on. No, it's not. Your job is to determine the case in front of you. There are, if you wanted to really get into it, in the EU, that's where you've got the notion from probably, they have this first country of origin thing, and the so-called Dublin 2 and Dublin 3 and all these things that you've got to send them back. To be frank with you, you get a lot of them in Europe, and it is a complete waste of time and money, because you're just better off to do the case and get it done with, because otherwise you have to do the Dublin case, which is go through the rules to see whether they should be sent back to Greece or Turkey or wherever they came from, and that's going to take you as much time, and it's unproductive. So it happens, they do move them back, send them back, but you probably know that well, you probably don't, but there's a famous case called the Belgium and Greece case, which went to the highest courts in Luxembourg, not in Luxembourg, the highest court in Europe, and the Belgians were sending people back to Greece to these horrible camps and so forth, where nobody looks after them, and there's all sorts of problems, and they barely can live. It's just pure subsistence. And the court there decided, no, Belgium, you can't do that because it's not a safe place for refugees to send them back, or potential refugees. So they then said, no, so you can't operate the Dublin Convention to send them back. So that does happen in Europe, and it's, there's huge problems there, so it's a huge point of contention. And we could go on for several weeks debating those issues. But basically, and there used to be things where you couldn't even from Britain send somebody back to France who may have come through France on the way, because the French for a long while would not accept non-state actors of persecution, nor did the Germans, until about 15, 20 years ago. And so it wasn't safe to send somebody back there because of the way they determined refugees. But that's not happening here, in this case, that's for sure. So, yeah, good questions, all of them. And you can see, as we tease these questions out, this is not easy. And there are all sorts of nuances in doing it. Okay, So, looking through it, and what's the harm, or the nature of the harm, as to his being persecuted if he's sent back? Did you have a chance to look at any of this, which keeps disappearing? Now, was there anything in here, and just give me the number of the page, that you think led to the answer of using the COI as to the nature of harm that he'd be at risk of, that you can see in the COI? On the first page. On the first page you can start to see things that are highlighted, can't you? Okay, so what's it talking about? Talking about silencing people and killing them, and it's even giving some percentages. Government promised an interim administration in the northeast. This is where this guy comes from. These are the sort of, that's why they're highlighted. So this is the covering page. Kill and silence opponents, recruit child soldiers, run the areas if controlled like a totalitarian regime. That's what we were talking about before. They overran the place. Human rights abuses, political killings carried out with impunity by both sides. So 200,000 fleeing homes during the year. So, pretty basic evidence of the potential for being persecuted coming out of this. Anything further you want to add to that? There's more, and obviously this is the summary, but the detail is later on. It's just a good example of how good, well-researched COI will help you get the answer or get answers. Anything further that arises from that? Anything else that you think helps you decide the nature of the harm? And does it amount to being persecuted? Even if we take the things in here and you thought he was at risk of some of those, are they at the level of being persecuted? And how are you going to find that out? Where do you go to find out whether they're at risk of being persecuted? Oh dear. Where do we go? Anybody? Where did I say this whole thing fitted? Refugee law? Where do we look for inspiration as to what amounts to being persecuted? Oh, you'll have to read it. A sustained or systemic violation of core human rights, don't we? So you can start off by looking at the ICCPR. Particularly, you'll get it in the ICCPR. Nearly all these things are core human rights that are the same all around the world, and you can look to see whether what's the treatment going on in Sri Lanka is tantamount to being persecuted by getting the same decision in any country around the world, because it'll fit under one or more of the articles protected and their high-level rights in the ICCPR. All right? So that's where you go. You don't go for a dictionary. You don't go for something that's just been dreamed up in a civil case or something like that. This is a piece of international law. You go to international law instruments to help you solve it. And those are what it's about. So it can be done because you know where to go. You're not sitting as you were for a moment there thinking, what's this guy talking about? You start immediately by seeing these things. What are they? Human rights abuses, political killings carried out with impunity. That's going to come under about 3 or 4 different high-level rights. The right to life, the right to protection of person, the right to political freedom. All these things are in the right to move around your own country. All those sorts of things are rights protected under the ICCPR and other human. They're in the UDHR as well. So that's really, and it says it's worsening violence. So it's getting worse, not better. So all these things will help you in reaching your decision as to whether they're at of being persecuted. In other words, the harm element is there. The harm is high enough to amount to being persecuted. So that's what I'm saying about using COI. It will help you to get those conclusions. And let's scroll on a bit more and see if there's anywhere. There you are. Again, we're coming up with the two part. This is the reasons behind it. Sinhalese predominantly Buddhist. Sinhalese are unlikely to make concessions to the this is all strengthening the type of case of the risk of persecution. It's giving a bit of history of the whole thing. And you need to get to know this thing if you're doing this sort of work. You have to put in the hard work of reading enormous amounts of country information until it starts to become, particularly if you're doing a number of cases, almost second-hand to you. And this highlighting of it too is something that good courts, New Zealand didn't do it as well. In Britain, counsel acting for people would do all this work for you. And so because you were having to do 3 or 4 cases a day, it would be presented to you from counsel with all the highlighted places there and refer you to it. And so you'd have a bundle of documents and they would say, right, we consider this, and the state appears in all the cases there, and they would say, we don't think it applies for the reasons ABC. The counsel for the asylum seeker would give you the explanation and the COI to back it up, because you get pad of documents this high, and you've only got, you have to read it all the night before, but you have to get on with it and get through 3, not that often, but about 2 cases minimum per day. So counsel can help you, and they really will help you, both sides. And if they don't, you tell them off. No, you just say, look, you need to cooperate more in giving us the information. Okay, so that's, it's all relevant, this history of it, what's gone on, ceasefire agreements, they forever were breaking down, and limiting the damage. This is more COI from the same people, and again, it gives you the whole costs of the war, the whole thing, political dynamics. So by the time you've read through this sort of stuff, even the geography is very important, because the point I think somebody raised before is, why does he move his business or something or other? That may just not be possible, and you can get COI that'll tell you or bake that up from it. Here are an executive summary. Is civil war again? This is 2008. You're getting right, very timely, because remember, you're making the decision at the time of the hearing, or the decision itself. Deepening abuses, same sort of story as we've seen a bit above. Much of the blame lies with the LTT itself. So Sri Lanka, of course, was also a bit more difficult, because you could have LTTE members doing some nasty things too. So what part of of Article 1 of the convention would that alert you to? Let's say there were people there committing some pretty horrible crimes who were in the LTTE, and it's an LTTE member that's before you. Can you think of what you would also be looking at? Under the Refugee Convention, remember I went through, there were several parts to it? 1A, B, C, D, E, F. What's F about? Exclusion. So it may be that it did happen and a lot of these people were excluded. You've got to find whether they're included first before you exclude them, but you may have to go on and look at exclusion, and it's not easy, but it happens. Famous case we had in New Zealand, which the Supreme Court eventually overturned my decision, where the guy who came before us was the captain of one of the LTTE ships, And he went back and forth from Myanmar, bringing all the guns and bombs and everything for the LTTE to do its job. And his ship broke down a little bit, out off the coast of India. The Indian Navy picked it up, and these guys had clambered into the lifeboats, and before they left, this guy was the captain, they blew it up. They blew up the boat with all the guns and everything on it. So it was one hell of an explosion. And anyway, the Indians took them. The Indians don't have, not parties to the Refugee Convention. And so some of them went back, and then this guy managed to escape, and eventually he ended up in New Zealand. He'd been the captain of the ship. So just as a thought, do you think he was somebody who should be excluded? Any views on that? Or do you think he should be included because he was at risk, clearly at risk from the government, the Sinhalese government? Any views? What's your opinions? What do you think? What does the UNHCR think? Yeah, you're nearly close to it. Yeah, or even a war crime. Because, you know why? Because those guns and those things were killing innocent children. You saw some of that was in there, and using child soldiers and all those sorts of things, which are breaches of the law of war and all of those things that are serious. So, in fact, we did exclude him. After going through and including him, we excluded him. Anyway, it went through all the courts, and our Supreme Court, in a fit of generosity, we thought, but anyway, said no. They didn't think he had a significant enough role to influence it. I tell one story. He wasn't the captain, he was the chief engineer. He was the chief engineer on the business, so therefore he wasn't, he wasn't directly involved. Sorry, but you can see what I mean. And so the decision on some other technical issues, they said we were wrong, and that he was entitled to refugee status. That's fine, but that's why a lot of and probably the Sri Lankans are the most difficult, because in some ways the more obvious they are and the more they've been involved in, the more they should be included. But the higher up the ranks and everything they are, the more they should be excluded. So you can see really difficult issues come up in it, in this sort of area. Yes, that's what you're employed for. Yes, it does. That's quite right. And when we looked at COI before, we didn't get into it in any depth, but quite clearly you must entertain both of it. It then comes up often largely to the reputation and research done by the, whether it's the Crisis Group or Human Rights Watch or something or other, and the integrity of the COI. As you can imagine, a lot of the Tamil material comes from TamilNet or something like that, which is quite clearly biased. And so you don't exclude it, you don't just say no, but you have to be very cautious in using, as Otasan's probably become aware. You can't just not look at it. You must consider it, but you must balance it up it really comes as to weight, as to the weight you give to such evidence, when balanced against more reputable perhaps, or more well-researched independent groups that are looking at it. And that would obviously include guidelines, because there's a whole lot of guidelines from the UNHCR, which come out regularly on those things. You'd be looking at those. You would probably have, you certainly have a Human Rights Watch report, you'd have Amnesty reports, you'd have a whole lot of other material, and you've probably got quite a lot of Tamil material. There's a lot published in Britain, and so again you've got a balancing exercise. And there may be things, frankly, there have. So occasionally there are things in TamilNet that when you researched for the particular person, it's not just TamilNet, there's other websites, but that's the most famous one, where it may clarify something and say that they don't fit with the other evidence.
You didn't mention the State Department report. Does that mean that you are not so rely on that?
The State Department reports, no, a lot of their material is quite good. But frankly, in the early days, when you used to sit there, it was about all we had. But I don't want to go on too much about it, but if you want to look at long term with the so-called DOS reports, Department of State reports, which we did a lot with Afghani cases. And of course, the UN sort of changed sides and moved around. So if you look at the sort of 1980s reports, you'll find the tone of them is totally different to the tone in the 1990s or in the 2000s. And so, which side are the Americans on at certain times will influence what's in the reports. But they're quite useful because if you've got somebody giving you a long history of what they've done, you'll be able to trace that over time, and it helps you in the total credibility assessment of such people. And you will find, there may be, for example, like Hazara people have always been badly treated, but some other groups, and of course Afghanistan is notorious for people changing sides all the time. 1 week they're together with one group of Taliban type people. Another time they're not. Sometime we're with the government. Sometime they're pro the president. Other times it is very, very difficult to follow. But that's when things like
that's the way with survival.
Yep, that's the survival. It's the survival of the fittest. You're quite right. And it is not easy. And then a lot of these guys who are the leaders of it, you find out that they're also really high up. That's the reason they got all the money in the drug trade and their poppy fields and all the rest of it. And well, they're not actually political. They're in the drug trade. And do you get to the thing where they've exclusion, where they've serious non-political crimes, and so again, all interesting and relevant issues that COI will, you're right, even slightly biased, COI will help you with a lot. Okay, so have we decided yet that this could amount to it? To being persecuted? I think we probably have, that there's potential for that anyway. So the law or authority that you rely on to tell you about whether the harm is persecution, or CIDTP is the sort of cruel, inhuman or degrading treatment or punishment. That's the test for the CAT, for the Convention Against Torture. Very similar and actually comes within persecution. It's just that the CAT applies to state persecution or state treatment. So what do you think? Where would you look for the authority or so forth to conclude whether the harm reaches that level? Where would we go? How serious it is? We'd look in the COI to see how often it went on. We'd look at the human rights instruments to see what happens. Is it a breach, fundamental breach of that? And we would also look at his evidence as to whether it was sustained or systemic in the system. These are all things that you can find either from the convention or from the COI or from there. In other words, you'd look in all parts of the evidence to determine that. And if you think indicating the relevant does, so in the last question, of course, is the real chance test. Do you consider on the evidence you've accepted, including the COI, and from the quick look you've made, do you think he had a well-founded fear of being persecuted? What's the consensus? Hand up those who think he had a real chance of being persecuted if he returned. You do. 1, 2, 3, 4. All right, we've got a split court, have we? Hands up those who think he hasn't got a well-founded fear of being persecuted on return. Okay, so 1. And so we've got quite a lot of people who don't vote. So we won't give them a job because they haven't made the decision. Sorry. Not even the benefit of the doubt. So, yep, there's, it indicates, I think, if you accept everything, that that there is a real chance of him being persecuted. And so, therefore, in the alternative, therefore you would say, if there's a convention reason, what's the convention reason here? Or reasons? What do you think? Race? Yep. Anything else? Yep. Hindu? Not Buddhist? Yep. Yeah. He got the lot, didn't he? And
Particular social group?
Particular, yeah, it could be a particular social group. He's not doing too badly, is he? He's got everything except nationality. So you can see it can be. So therefore, he would, on the face of it, be confirmed as a refugee. In other words, he had that status as soon as he arrived, and all you were doing is confirming it. And so you've ticked all those boxes and declare him or recognise him to be a refugee. However, just the last question, if in the alternative is assumed the credibility concerns were sound and you only accepted part of his story as credible as it related to the LTTE and his business background, but not his evidence as it related to his time in Colombo, in the police detention and the release, your point, which is exactly a very, very good one, about this funny story of being to the restaurant and so forth, do you still consider that he would be a refugee, that he's got a well-founded fear? In other words, you're not accepting about half of his story. Does it still get him there or not? Yep. All right, any other views? Anybody else? Anybody? Or you're all sitting on the fence? No other views? Now, it's a good case because it's a case where there's partial acceptance of credibility, and it doesn't mean that means you throw the whole case out. It means what have you accepted as facts from this person? And when you put that together, in other words, it gives you maybe a smaller profile of evidence. You still test it against the COI, but that is the distinguishing factors. Would somebody with this set of characteristics objectively be at risk when they went back after you've rejected some of the evidence with good reasons for the rejection? All right. So we've gone through it rather quickly, more than a great deal of depth, but for those of you who are students looking for your credits, we're going to send you 2 more. One, which I think is quite an easy one, and one, the Fijian one, and the second one is a Malaysian one, and that will make you think, because our friend raised about people from Malaysia, people in Malaysia. This is a case of Malaysian coming to Japan, or wherever you like to say, and he's a big-time gambler. And so it's an interesting case. So your bullet points in about 1,000 words would be very interesting. And all I can tell you, the biggest guidance is just try and use this as best you can to get you through it. Otherwise you won't know where to start. So if you can just go through, read it, look at the COI, and bullet point what your answer is and what you think your conclusion is, then we'll mark that, and that will be really the main basis of getting your your credit and your attendance at the second course. And at the second course, because quite a bit of that, and hopefully with a number of lawyers there, may be a little legalistic for you. And I'm sorry about that, but it's because a lot of the lawyers have requested that we do that. And because it's fascinating, for the first time we have a number of translated decisions. And there's two ladies here who are to be thanked, because from Congo they have law students. They've done a fantastic job in translating some key decisions into English. And so we can now compare them with what cases of a like nature. It's just an academic exercise. It's not here to criticise either side, but it's there to just say, well, if this case came up in most Western countries or even in Africa, this is probably what the answer would be, rather than or the same as what you're saying. So that's the detail of the second course. And then remember that you've got the Sunday, the Sunday the 17th, you're right. No, it starts on the 12th. Yeah. Yeah, you get a day off in the middle, or 2 days off in the middle. So it's the 12th and the 17th, and then we'll do a summary, and there'll be a lot of interesting people on the night of the Sunday about the same time as this, same time tag. Whereabouts, Sato Sensei, here or?
Maybe, but I will check.
Okay.
Then,
so you'll need to check out, and Sujin will email you with where it is. And so come along. You'll meet a lot of interesting people from a lot of interesting human rights bodies and human security people. You'll meet a current judge from New Zealand, Martin Treadwell, who is also the president of the IO, and he's on the board of the IOMJ, and the president of the Asia Pacific chapter. Anyway, we'll also send out to you the actual case. Mr. Bala's case. It's not Bala, it's not his name. It's called MN, I think it was. Oh no, it's not got a name on it. It's just got a number, 76199 2008, written by a very good member or judge, Andy Malloy, who writes in nice, clear English. And you can read through it and go through the story and get the full detail, and you can see what happened. What do you think happened? What do you think happened with his credibility to start with, just as a guess? Any bidders? What do you think? Status granted? Yep. What about his credibility? Totally accepted? After and you'll see the nice way which sort of follows this thing, not word for word, but he sets out the issues after setting out all the material evidence, only 5 pages, he gets through it, double spacing, it's not huge, and he goes carefully through the evidence. Then he says the issues, and the inclusion clause, which you've just read, says, in terms of, and this is really the New Zealand case way back in 96, the principal issues are objectively, on the facts as found, is there a real chance of being persecuted if returned to his country of nationality? Couldn't get much clearer, almost simpler. Slap in the face, that's what you've got to do. If the answer is yes, is there a convention reason for, it should say, for being persecuted? It's an old one that says for that persecution. Anyway, he then, what does he do immediately? Credibility assessment. Before turning to address the principal issues identified, it is necessary to determine whether the appellant is a credible witness. For reasons set out below, he's good signalling where we're going, the authority, it was called an authority, finds his claim is credible, comma, in part. Okay? And then he goes through and analyses the evidence. And lots of parts about being, as our alert friend here said, being at the restaurant and that sort of thing, he didn't find too credible, and he gave good reasons for it. He then went through, having done all that, summary of the credible evidence. In other words, this is the profile or the characteristics of the person. The authority rejects the appellant's claim to having been detained by the Sri Lankan police, to have been released through the interaction with a member of the Corona group, to have been subjected to demand for payment. In contrast, there is a clear difference in the quality and nature of the appellant's evidence about the problems he experienced in north of Sri Lanka and those he experienced in Colombo. So I think we might have a recruit here. So but you probably know a bit more about that part of the world than the rest of us. So anyway, the authority has been provided with a written statement signed by his wife supporting her successful application in Canada. The statement is broadly consistent with the claim outlined by the appellant. While there are minor areas that are divergent, the appellant's wife has not been interviewed in person. In other words, she wasn't in New Zealand, and she has not had the opportunity to elaborate on the contents of her brief written statement. He's covering the fairness issues. In other words, we haven't given a full chance to her to be for evidence. Having heard from the appellant and having had the opportunity to consider all the evidence, the authority finds that his claim with respect to his problems with the LTEE is credible. Nice, clear statements. He then goes on to find, then this is the profile thing I was talking about, therefore finds the appellant is a Sri Lankan man of Tamil ethnicity from the north of Sri Lanka. He has an idiosyncratic injury, in other words, his leg, which is readily apparent and makes him easily identifiable. So subjective elements making it objectively. In his capacity as a businessman, he was subject to ongoing demands by the LTTE sector. He was also subject to one significant demand for a large amount of money that he didn't comply with. The authority finds the appellant and his family left the north and went to Malaysia, etc. It is on this basis the authority then turns to the country information. So we're not going to just pluck the decision out of the sky, we're going to then assess it. Then he goes in a whole lot of stuff that we were just looking at. Human Rights Watch report, UNHCR report, United Kingdom country of origin report, lots of stuff. And then he quotes certain parts of it which are relevant. He goes to the DOS report, you're quite right. Refers to the endemic use of police torture as a means of extracting admissions, etc. This is mirrored in Amnesty International. You can see how much COI he went to, 2 or 3 pages of it. Even the report from the Special Rapporteur on Torture, Manfred Novak, who's quite a good friend of mine, from his visit to Sri Lanka earlier that month. Right, very timely, saying the problems that were there, and the 2006 ICG report we've looked at. So then he states simply, again, points where his decision is going, the appellant's claim is assessed against that general background, taking all of the evidence. Then he comes back to the issue. What was the issue again? Oh yes, objectively on the facts as found is a real chance, etc. For the purposes of refugee determination, being persecuted has been described as, sustained or systemic violation of basic and core human rights, demonstrative of a failure of state protection. 2 arms again. The threshold is not whether the appellant will be persecuted, but rather where is the real chance. So we're not looking for certainty, just a real chance. If returned on the authority of that Chan decision from Australia we were talking about, in which persecution is established as real, not remote, speculative, chance. For the reasons below, the authority finds there is a real chance, it would be subject to serious harm tantamount to being persecuted, so he's got that right there. He's a young male, he's got the idiosyncratic injury at the time he left, the appellant was failed to pay, etc., the LTTE. Given the conditions outlined in the COI, it is real as opposed to remote chance of being identified when he returns to the north. If he returns. Then he goes on a little bit about internal protection, whether he can have that in Colombo, refers to Michigan guidelines for assistance and does a pretty thorough job on that. Finds that after that, if he's serious harm, if he returned to the North, it further follows that he would, given he can't relocate because of his age, sex, ethnicity, his injury, all contribute to the real chance and being picked up, as we were talking about, in Colombo or in the roadblocks in the neighbouring areas. And it became apparent he has no employment or other reason to be if it became. He is not registered as a residence there, which is a big thing. He doesn't have household registrations, which is the way they pick you up, and has lived only briefly while he's there. So, satisfied the chance he'd be mistreated in this way and is real rather than remote. Satisfied no internal protection alternative. Satisfied this convention reason is imputed political opinion. So the second issue, he said himself, his answers in the affirmative. He therefore finds objectively on the facts he faces persecution reason, and the appellant is a refugee within 1A2. Refugee status is granted. The appeal is allowed. So you can have a look at that. It's a very good, well-written decision. You know, a lot of them are a lot bigger and a lot more complex, but if you can, you know, this is what somebody who knows their job well and writes well should do. All right? Anyway, it's just a good small example. Okay, beautiful timing. Thank you.